Hello! In a previous video, I ended by proposing a question about language authority. If language is naturally unstable, then who's to say what authority determines what's correct? In other words, who gets to decide whether or not using language in one way or another is acceptable? Considering the flexibility and even slipperiness of language, to what extent do we think that language authorities are justified? This may seem supremely nerdy, but language authorities do exist, and they do exert great influence over us throughout our daily lives, yielding a sometimes significant impact on us. Therefore, it's up to us as individuals to explore this issue and figure out where we stand, philosophically speaking. In this video, we'll explore two different attitudes towards language usage: prescriptivism and descriptivism. First, however, I want to quickly clarify what I mean by language authority. The most readily available example is something that we've all experienced at one time or another in school. You write something down and turn it in, and when you get it back with a grade, you find that your instructor has marked certain things as wrong or incorrect. This could be spelling, word choice, sentence structure, potentially all kinds of things related to your use of language. And maybe you even got points taken off because of it. This is an example of a language authority exercising power over your use of language, evaluating your usage and deeming it substandard or straight up incorrect. We'll talk a bit more about different kinds of language authorities later in the video, but this is basically what we're talking about. Language is always changing. Why is some authority justified in telling me that I'm using it wrong? There is no correct answer to these questions because they are argumentative issues. And when you start investigating different viewpoints related to language authority and correctness, two general attitudes emerge: prescriptivism and descriptivism. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that most people aren't absolutely rooted on either end of this spectrum. And whether or not your attitude is prescriptivist or descriptivist may have a lot to do with the specific context of usage. In other words, you may have some prescriptivist ideas about language in some circumstances and descriptivist leanings in others. Remembering this will help you explore the complexity of your own attitude as we move on with the discussion. So let's get right into it. Prescriptivism. Generally speaking, prescriptivism involves the idea that you can use language improperly. In other words, there is an absolute right way and wrong way to use language. One way to think about it is by considering the word itself. If there's something wrong with you, you may get a prescription from a doctor. That's basically how prescriptivism works. You're doing language wrong, and here's what you need to do to fix it. If it's true then that there are right and wrong ways to use language, then proficiency, that is, how good you are at language use, has to do with how accurate your usage happens to be. That means that learning language is all about knowing and following the rules, which traditionally you would find in a grammar book. Essentially, prescriptivism is all about the idea that, as it says here, correctness and meaning are determined by an authority. Maybe that authority is the grammar book previously mentioned, but it could also just be a dictionary, which, as David Foster Wallace notes in his article Tense Present, we regular citizens often consult for authoritative guidance. It's like if you and a friend are having an argument about what a word means, you can always get that dictionary out, or go to a website on your phone more likely, and see who's right, according to the authority. Now, there is some irony in this approach, especially with printed dictionaries, because language is always changing, and well, I'll give you an example. I was given a large dictionary, a really, really big one, like 1,200 pages, by my father, who I think got it at a yard sale, bless his heart. Other than using it as a doorstop, I found it to be a great prop for the classroom because, wow, it's huge, it must have everything in there. Then you look, and you find that the word internet isn't even in there, despite the fact that it was printed in the early 1990s. So what kind of authority is that? Anyway, I digress. We have other kinds of language authorities to consider. If you live in a society based on written law, as we do in the United States, we have our Constitution, legal code, etc., then there is probably some language authority that interprets that writing and decides whether or not laws are constitutional. In the United States, it's the Supreme Court, who's the ultimate language authority, not just in the case of obscenity trials or something, but interpreting the language of the Constitution in general. This is a kind of direct governmental language authority. Then there are familial language authorities, parents, grandparents, relatives, saying things like, you can't say that at the table, or we don't use those words in this house, or please stop dropping F-bombs, and you can't argue, right? Or else the authority sends you to your room or threatens to revoke your video game privileges or something. Could also be that the authority we're still respecting is some guy who died hundreds of years ago. That may be a bit morbid, but it's true that a lot of our rules in English were developed quite some time ago, and yet, despite language changing, we're still working under those rules. And some of those rules were pretty arbitrary, like the one about split infinitives. The infinitive form of a verb is kind of like the most general one: to live, to walk, to go. And there's this rule we have that we can't split them, specifically that you're not supposed to put an adverb between the to in the infinitive and the other part of the infinitive. But why not? Well, in Latin, the infinitive for to go is ire, which literally can't be split because it's just one word. Therefore, this old arbitrary logic goes, since you can't split an infinitive in Latin, you shouldn't be allowed to split one in English either, even though English infinitives are comprised of two words. Oh yeah, don't forget your humble English teachers. They're also language authorities, whether you like it or not, since they're the ones with the red pens. I'll be transparent with you here and confess that, if you haven't already figured it out, I'm pretty skeptical of a hardline prescriptivist approach. That doesn't mean I'm right, of course, it's just my viewpoint. It's up to you to decide what approach to language usage you think is best. And prescriptivism has its benefits. For example, when people are using language in a standardized way, it's potentially a lot easier to communicate. I encourage you to consider what other benefits this approach to language usage might have. There is also the extreme grammar authoritarian, however, which can be problematic. This is the kind of person whose zeal for the rules of usage are so strong that they are absolutely intolerant of any diversion at all. Maybe you know someone like this. Maybe it's you. And that's okay. I won't judge. Someone who will annoy everyone at a party by correcting sentences. I knew someone like this in graduate school. A small group of friends would go out in the evenings to enjoy the city, and this dude would just obsess over a word choice to the point that the rest of us were like, can we not invite him next time? Hopefully that's not you, but maybe it is, and maybe you have a good reason for being like that. If so, let's hear it. Okay, moving on to the other side of the argument. Descriptivism. In stark contrast to the strict grammar authoritarian, the radical descriptivist might argue that all usage is acceptable, even if the only audience who understands the usage is the one uttering the words. Again, remember that this is a kind of spectrum, and you're likely not going to be all the way on one side or the other, and what attitude you have is going to have a lot to do with a specific usage context. Anyway, what is descriptivism? Is it just the idea that we should defend those who babble nonsense to the trees? Well, maybe, in some kind of perverse extreme, but descriptivism is more about understanding language as effective in individual contexts and not according to a rigid universal authority. For descriptivists, whether or not language is being used properly has less to do with its accuracy to a traditional standard and more to do with its effectiveness in a given context. From this perspective, then, proficiency in language has to do with how well one can adapt to different usage contexts. In order to be good at language, you have to be able to modulate your usage based on context and audience, not in contrast to the prescriptivist attitude, just adhere to the standard rules. The idea here is basically that there are various situations in life in which language is used differently, and adapting authentically in these situations is ideal. You're going to speak one way with your friends, another way maybe with your instructors or bosses, another with the server at a restaurant, etc., etc. This need to adapt usage to context, from the descriptivist perspective, means that you learn not from your grammar books and by memorizing the rules, but by practicing authentic self-expression, your style, your voice, but in a way that's guided by your observations about others and how others around you use language in different contexts. So it comes down to this. For descriptivists, correctness and meaning are determined by context and audience, not a strict authority. Or another way to look at it is that context and audience are the authority, and so the standard to which you should aspire in your usage depends on what's going on and who you're talking to. This brings us to the idea of discourse communities, which we will discuss in another video. For now, I would like to finish up by asking you to consider these two attitudes towards correctness in language usage, prescriptivism and descriptivism, and think about where your own attitude happens to be. Are there times when you're one or the other? Are you generally leaning to one attitude or the other?